Hello and welcome to U.S. History 109. This is U.S. History from 1865 until the present day. So this week we are looking at Chapter 12. Oh, and my name is Professor Jennifer Haynes. We are looking at Chapter 12, and your title for this week is Post-War Prosperity and Cold War Fears, 1945 to 1960. So the first thing I need to let you know in history is that historians don't believe there's ever been true communism as what Karl Marx wrote about ever on Earth. Chinese communism, Soviet Union communism, Cuban communism were all dictatorships pretending to be communists. Okay. You can call your government a democracy and have, votes, and then throw them all away. There's plenty of countries that do that. That doesn't mean that it's a democracy at all. Okay, so it's really important to understand that as you're learning about the Soviet Union, especially under Stalin, that it was not a true, it wasn't communism. Another factor about communism is land. Karl Marx kind of calls for the redistribution of land and not having it as private property, which really scares Americans. And we're like, oh, what? But you have to understand who owned the land back then. Who owned the land would be only the elites, the nobles, and possibly the Catholic Church. Poor people didn't own any land at all. There wasn't really a middle class. So 85% of the people didn't own any land at all, okay? And then if you were from a rich, wealthy family, only the oldest son would inherit all the land. And then, son number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 15 would have to have a trade. And he would not get any land at all. And if you're a daughter, well, you don't get anything either. So it's really important because this land redistribution was a novel idea, because let's say that you were starving back in this time frame, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, and you're a poor peasant and you're starving, and you went hunting to feed your family keep them from starvation on no nobility's land or church land. You could be executed. Okay, so it was really stiff, and something needed to be done with the land, and we don't really understand that in the U.S. because when we came here, that's why so many people moved, because land was running out in Europe, and land meant you could vote, land meant you had power. So that's why we took the lands from the Indians. Someone already owned it. Anyway, so today I just kind of a background on communism. So we're on Chapter 12, Post-War Prosperity and Cold War Fears. We're going to talk a lot about the Cold War. And I always open this segment by showing a clip from Red Dawn. Now you have to understand, when I was in middle school, it was in the 1980s. And we're talking about 1945 to 1960 right now, correct? Okay. In the middle of the 1980s, okay. Red Dawn is about Russians coming, taking over, and having to hide from them, okay? 20 years later, so this Red Scare that we're going to talk about, Joseph, where is he? Joseph McCarthy, not McCartney. Joseph McCarthy. Oh, he's not on here yet. Joseph McCarthy, there was so much fear and propaganda that it lasted. Still, we talk to people my age and older, and it still is it's a scary scenario. Red Dawn was actually redone, right? If you've seen it, I have seen it with my sons. And it's supposed to be North Korea, okay? So depending on the threat. So this was long after the Cold War was over, because the wall fell in the 80s, 1989. We're talking about the Berlin Wall as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and show the opener to Red Dawn, which really cracks me up after I began showing it to classes because I never really understood the beginning. There's a history teacher is the beginning of the movie. How apropos. And he's talking about Genghis Khan. And he's talking about the Mongols, which are like my favorite love-hate relationship because the Mongols are incredible. They conquered more land than anyone except for the English Empire, and had it for 95 years. They couldn't hold on to it for very long because they weren't really good at government. But this is what opens for this clip, and you'll see what happens to him. So let me pull that up. Get started. Okay, here's a clip from Red Dawn.
Always began with the army spread out in a semicircle, I would say about the size of Rhode Island. Then they would ride forward, driving everything before them. Beast, men, even bugs. Now the ends would kind of close in to form a shrinking circle. And everything within that circle panicked to get out. When the Mongols could see each other, they had worked themselves up into a pretty good frenzy. Now, when this killing started, it lasted for days, weeks, even months. And it went on until the young son of the Khan asked his father, that the last creature alive, be allowed to go free. Well now, my friend. Well now. All right, check it out. All right. Look pretty cool though, man. I would say they were way off course. This is very unusual.
You do something, Mr. Teasdale.
Don't kill the history teacher.
Don't yell us! Don't yell us, my friend! Overshibo!
Okay, so the rest of the movie, basically, they just they get away. These teenagers, they live in the mountains or the woods, and they combat, the Russians. So I have to tell you that I would be in band class with these huge windows, and we would actually. It still worried us. It's just amazing to look back and see how, such propaganda, which is one of your words, really affected generations to come. Okay, so that movie was in 1984 with Patrick Swayze, of course. So propaganda was in your book, and it's defined as information, ideas, or rumors deliberately spread to keep or harm a person, a group. You can help them or harm. So these are words that are to help or harm a person, group, movement, nation, institution, and it uses a lot of fear. And so there was a lot of U.S. propaganda against Russia and vice versa. So then you have Joseph Stalin, who, in your book, Churchill and Truman, FDR met with him first, but they made this deal with the devil. They didn't really know who Stalin was. They thought he was going to be, a good ruler, and he was not. In fact, Stalin actually killed more people than Hitler did. He killed more of his own people. He starved 8 million people in the Ukraine. He didn't like farmers, and he starved them. And also, Stalin would, stage a rally, and he would ask his soldiers to look for someone who did not clap hard enough, and they would actually pull those people out and shoot them to make an example of them. So Stalin was crazy. So I always have to tell people this because it's true. So I'm going to show you a picture of my dad, and you don't have to agree. But I have the nicest dad, and he tells like corny jokes, and he's fantastic. But he looks a lot like Stalin. Like he has like the handlebar mustache and that sort of thing. And so Stalin had show trials and just killed and murdered and killed his own friends. They believe he killed his wife. And his friends just lived in fear. So anyway, so I just want to show you a picture quickly of my dad. So here's a picture of my dad. He's on the right, of course. And there's a picture of Stalin. When I see pictures of Stalin, it just kind of creeps me out because my dad's always had that handlebar mustache. But like I said, my dad's super nice. Stalin, not so much. So there you have a picture of Stalin. Okay. Okay, so now we're back, and we will cover some more information. So African Americans that served in World War II and in the war industry, they wanted the same rights when they got home, because when they were abroad, they were fighting against people who were discriminating, of course, against the Jews. And when they got home, they were very sadly mistaken because there was not a change. There wasn't equal rights for them. So there was a lot of demobilizing of the armed forces. Right here, African American soldiers we just talked about. During this time when white men went off to war in World War II, there was another opening of the door for women and for African Americans to work in the factory, because they were not allowed to have those really good paying jobs. In the North, they were discriminated against. African Americans were, and women weren't allowed to work. And the Feminine Mystique is really an amazing book by Betty Friedan, and she was married, and she just talks about what's happening to women. They're educated, but as soon as they're married, they must stay home, or you're kind of looked down upon. Now, this is only middle class and upper class white women, but they were being very controlled. And so they couldn't work. Maybe you got a degree in education. Maybe you got a degree in psychology. It didn't matter. And oftentimes when you got pregnant and had a baby, you would be fired. And she really talks about that and how far, along women have come. She talks about how these women are asked to kind of put their dreams away. And there's like this sadness, and all these women in the suburbia are going to psychologists and on depression medicine because they are depressed, because they had a dream of being something, but then society kind of said, you don't have a choice. You have to, you can't be a professor, you can't be a teacher, or you can't, do both if that's your choice. Or, some people may have chosen to stay home, and that is perfectly fine, but it's a woman's choice. And so they were very unhappy, and that's why it's called the Feminine Mystique. All right, the GI Bill, I believe it's up here. It said that you could get free college, home loans, and unemployment if you didn't have a job as a, an armed force soldier coming home from the war. The only problem was this did not really help African American soldiers. The only colleges they could go to were black colleges. They weren't allowed to go to white colleges. And many banks would not give them loans for homes. So they weren't able to get home loans. So this GI Bill was great for whites, but it really didn't help blacks at all. And if you don't, something you may not understand is if my parents owned a home and my grandparents owned a home, it builds up equity, it's sold, that you can disperse that to your children. You can use that, to help pay for college and that sort of thing. But if you're not allowed to buy a home and banks won't give you money and they aren't fair, and you're not allowed to live in white neighborhoods, even if you have the money, you don't have that equity buildup, which is like something we don't often think about. Okay. Also, there were 9,000 gay and lesbians that served in World War II, and they were kicked out and they did not receive the GI Bill either. All right. A lot of people were upset and lamenting the awful things that happened in the Japanese internment camps, which you actually read. George Takei's, or you actually listened to his TED Talk last week. You were supposed to. Truman developed the federal minimum wage. He called it the Fair Deal, not the New Deal, building on FDR. He desegregated the armed forces. Congress would not pass a bill, though, making lynching a federal crime, which is really awful in the 1940s. Truman also passed the Taft-Hartley bill, and it was against unions. And, blacks and women still needed protection in the unions because they were not treated equally. Talk about the Cold War. It's part of your title. Winston Churchill was at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri during a graduation. And that's where he came up, in his speech, he came up with the term Iron Curtain, which you heard a lot. You heard a lot about in the Cold War time period. So I was just going to play a little piece of that because I just think it's super interesting. So let's put me in the corner. And here he is, Winston Churchill. And this is his Iron Curtain speech.
The Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. And all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow.
All right. Okay, so that is his speech that he made, the first reference to Iron Curtain. Okay. All right, so they started talking about containment. Oh, let me make myself a little bigger. So they started talking about containment, the domino theory, worrying about the Soviet Union taking over other countries. And the reason being is because the U.S. Embassy, American that was in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow said that Moscow was intending to destroy rival nations. So it was very scary. Then we have the Marshall Plan in 1948, which I believe his name was George Marshall. He came up with a plan to help Europe nations rebuild because they were devastated. He was the first soldier and I believe the only soldier to ever receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And there's a little section in your book on that, or in your digital book as well. Very interesting. And it also, you know, giving and loaning money to Europe would also boost the American economy, American culture, and selling American goods. Then you have East and West Berlin were divided. They really didn't think Stalin was this type of person. They didn't know they had made a deal with the devil to defeat Hitler, but they did. Also, they find out that the Soviet Union had atomic bombs. Mao Zedong in China also was communist. And we say communist in air quotes. Remember, communism is a tyranny or dictatorship. It's not real communism. If you read the Communist Manifesto and what Karl Marx intended, it's a great idea. Some people don't know that it could ever really work on Earth because there's greed. But it's not the communism that you hear about. Then you have Joseph McCarthy, who was a famous senator from Wisconsin. He was a Republican. And in 1950, he really began to instill fear and terror into the American public. We already had this Red Scare. Everybody's afraid of communists. And people were being deported and that sort of thing for communism. And, you know, that's where you get the ACLU. People were, you know, sympathetic towards communists, or, you know, you can be a communist in the U.S. It doesn't mean that you're going to win. Because it is, you know, a land where you can be a free thinker and have free thoughts, and that's fine. But they really just were, you know, the propaganda and the terror and the fear. So they were deporting people, blacklisting people. It was an absolute nightmare. And Joseph McCarthy was really in the center of it. So that went on for years. FBI Order 9835. And then they had this Hewitt Committee, House Committee on Un-American Activity. If you refused to testify, you'd be in prison. There were some spies that were executed. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Julius, the husband, did sell secrets to the Soviet Union. But both Ethel and Julius were convicted and executed. But then later they found evidence that Ethel never did any of it, and she was also executed, but she was not a spy. So even if you invoke the Fifth Amendment, not speaking, you are accused of being a communist. All right, and then we have, so we need to take a look at, we're going to take a look at Mr. McCarthy. And take a look at him. Joseph McCarthy, the senator. I think that's now. Let's see. Yes, we are. Okay. And let me just set this up for you. So Joseph McCarthy was out of control. He said that he had a list of 250 or so people that were communists. He just wouldn't stop. Like, he loved this attention. He loved creating this fearful chaos. And he was accusing the army of being infiltrated. So there were hearings between him and the army, and he goes up against a lawyer who, you know, a stupid kid at Yale, joined a communist sympathizer party, and then he realized that that's not really who he was. He was just, you know, sowing his wild oats, and he joined this man's firm, and they had talked about it. And they put it out in the open with the senator, and they said, you know, you don't need to bring this up. And he brings it up anyway. And this is kind of the turning point where 6 months later, Joseph McCarthy was censored by the U.S. government because he wasn't telling the truth. He wasn't bringing forth facts. He was just stirring up fear and chaos. So let's take a look at this. Have you no decency? All right, here we go.
TV during the day were glued to watching the Army McCarthy hearings. The television moment of the Army-McCarthy hearings that has lived in memory ever since is the famous moment on June 9th, 1954, when McCarthy decides to violate an agreement that Cohn and Welch had come to before the hearings.
Roy Cohn, although of perfect draft age, had managed to avoid the Korean War and the draft afterwards. It was kind of astonishing. Joe Welch said, fine, I will never bring up your draft status, but we have a problem of our own. We have a young attorney named Fred Fisher, who was a member of a communist front group while he was at Harvard Law School, and we brought him down to work on the committee. We decided that because of his past, we would send him home, and I would appreciate it if you would never bring up Fred Fisher.
Throughout most of that afternoon, Roy Cohn and Joseph Welch had been having, your basic nasty lawyerly argument, and Cohn's okay with it.
Mr. Welch, sir, with great respect, I work for the committee here. They know how we go about handling situations of communist infiltration and failure to act on FBI information about communist infiltration.
And may I add my small voice, sir, and say whenever you know about a subversive or a communist or a spy, please hurry. Will you remember those words?
Mr.
But
Welch,
McCarthy
sir,
gets so
with great
angry at
respect.
Welch's badgering of Roy Cohn that he blurts out the name of Fred Fisher.
In view of Mr. Welch's request, I think we should tell him that he has in his law firm a young man named Fisher, who has been for a number of years a member of an organization which was named, years and years ago, as the legal bulwark of the Communist Party. And I have hesitated bringing that up, but I have been rather bored with your phony request to Mr. Cohn here.
Little did I dream you could be so reckless and so cruel as to do an injury to that lad. It is true he is still with Hallandor. It is true that he will continue to be with Hallandor. It is, I regret to say, equally true that I fear he shall always bear a scar needlessly inflicted by you.
You'll look at Roy Cohn's face and you will see him go, oh my God, no, please no. But McCarthy won't stop. He keeps attacking.
I want to say, Mr. Welch, that it has been labeled long before he became a member, as early as 1944.
Senator, may we not drop this? I did you, I think, no personal injury, Mr. Cohn.
No, sir.
And if I did, I beg your pardon. Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
You could see Joe McCarthy going, what did I do? What did I do? Joe Welch literally has a tear in his eye. This was seen as spontaneous. In fact, Welch had been thinking of this for months. Jim St. Clair, who was second in command to Joe Welch, said, we walked out the side door. The door closed behind us. He winked at me and said, how did I do? And they said, great, you did great.
The fact that McCarthy really didn't seem to have any sense of decency, and the fact that he'd been caught publicly in lies over the course of these 6 weeks, the public's capacity to trust him, the belief that he was engaged in this anti-communist crusade as some sort of earnest attempt to protect American society, as opposed to a demagogic bullying spree. At the end of it, I think all the illusions, the comfortable illusions, that McCarthy had cultivated about himself had effectively been dispelled.
It was as if the entire country had been waiting for somebody to finally say this line, "Have you no sense of decency?" to Senator McCarthy. That's the moment where McCarthy incinerates himself on national TV. It's the moment in which the dragon that is Joseph McCarthy is finally slain.
So it is really important to note that Joseph McCarthy became a senator very young. I want to say like 36, 37 in Wisconsin. And as soon as this happened, I want to say no one trusted him, and he pretty much drank himself to death. And I believe he died at age 56. But he was hunting for communists. He accused Arthur Miller, who was a playwright. It was a witch hunt, fears, lies, propaganda. This is why it's so important to know where to find academic sources. Because even today we hear all kinds of news, and it is so important to know where you can look to find the truth, because you can. And I've taught you with, Coffee House. We had that Coffee House Day, and where you can find those academic sources, and where you can even go different websites that have a neutral fact-checking stance. So also during this time, gays and lesbians were being rooted out and fired from U.S. governments. And the reason is there was another senator, his name was, what was in your book? I think it's Dirksen. He called them lavender lads. He said the gay men were lavender lads, and that they were morally weak, and that they would betray their country because someone would blackmail them. Because at that time, up until the 1970s, if you were gay or lesbian, even if you did a great job at your place of work, even if you were professional, smart, wonderful record, if someone found out that you were gay or lesbian, they could fire you without any pushback, without anything that you could do, because it was considered a mental illness at that time. And what's really sad about this, saying they're morally weak, and that they said that the Russians could blackmail them for secrets, is that there was no proof of this. There was no evidence of this, and that's what we go on in academia. It's very, very sad. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is the Korean War, which we know North Korea and South Korea have been divided. The Korean War, we got into the Korean War, and I don't know if you've ever heard of the sitcom MASH, but I just wanted to show you the beginning of it. And there actually is someone in in MASH. There's a character who keeps dressing up like a woman because he wants to be sent home. Because if you were, cross-dressing or anything like that, you could be sent home and kicked out. But no one believes him. They know he just wants to go home. But anyway, this is MASH, if you've never seen it. I grew up watching it, so I had to take the time to show it to you. All right, I'll go back in the corner. And here it is. This is the first full episode. Oh, I muted it. Sorry about that. Does that song sound familiar?
Attention all personnel. Report immediately to admitting ward and operating room. Attention all personnel. Report immediately to admitting ward and operating room.
Hawkeye here. You said I sounded a bit callous about my job in my last letter. Well, let me see if I can put it another way. In this particular mobile army hospital, we're not concerned with the ultimate reconstruction of the patient. We only care about getting the kid out of here alive enough for someone else to put on the fine touches. We work fast and we're not dainty because a lot of these kids who can stand 2 hours on the table just can't stand 1 second more.
Okay, so that is about a couple of doctors in Korea during the Korean War, and there's a mobile army hospital, what you saw there. Okay, all right, now we want to talk about the American dream. We love to hear about it, but it wasn't accessible to everyone. Dwight D. Eisenhower became president, and in your book it did say We Like Ike was one of the themes, and I wanted to show you a commercial from that because it was really, it's pretty funny. What's funny is, like, when I teach political science, the history of political science, I show several political ads, and you know, some of them are all about fear, okay, making you be afraid if the other person's, you know, nominated. Some have no message at all. Others use facts, and they don't attack character, and they just talk about the facts and you know, what they're going to offer. And it's really interesting, you know, what candidates use, you know, which kind. And so this is a commercial for Dwight D. Eisenhower, and it really doesn't have a huge message, but it is very famous, so I thought I'd show it to you. And your book mentioned it, so there's that. Here we go.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Harry, let's do that big job right. Let's get in step with the guy that's left, get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat.
Okay, so you like Ike, I like Ike. So during this time of his presidency, Eisenhower started building up nuclear weapons and stockpiling them. And then you had MAD in your book, stands for mutually assured destruction. So basically, if there was a war, the whole world would be destroyed. This was kind of a problem because as they began doing their stockpiles, then Russia did. And then you get to the Reagan years where trillions of dollars were spent. Instead of helping our own people, we were, you know, building nuclear weapons. And then those nuclear weapons were disarmed and trillions of dollars in debt. And, you know, as you study, you'll find that that debt was not paid until Clinton. And Clinton actually was a centrist, which means he had social spending of Democrats and, you know, fiscal cuts of Republicans, and he actually balanced the budget, and there was not a nation debt at that time, but it took from Reagan to Clinton to pay for it. So anyway, so that's the time frame that you're talking about. Artificial intelligence, computers, technologies, bomb shelters, which is really funny because they were like talking about artificial intelligence, and now you hear that all the time because it's real, okay? They would have pamphlets, this was in your book, How to Survive an Atomic Bomb Blast, Sputnik, and that sort of thing. So I wanted to show you a funny clip from Grease 2. You are familiar with Grease 1. This is about bomb shelters were built all over, and this is in a bomb shelter, and this is about a teenage high school boy that's trying to get his girlfriend to do something romantically sexual with him because his buddies are outside sounding a siren and you know, casting fear and propaganda to get his girlfriend to do things that she does not want to do. It's a little bit humorous. So we're going to show this from Grease, and she says no, by the way. I was going to show it to you because it's a bomb shelter and it's a movie. Do it for your country. And here we go. So his friends are outside the bomb shelter doing a siren like Russians are coming.
It started. America is calling. Let's care enough to give our very best.
What started? What's happening, Louis?
The Russians are attacking. Get down! For if we give our very best, I know that we will more than pass the test.
What are you doing, Louis? Get off of me!
Think about it. What if you and me was to die right here tonight without ever doing it?
It? Oh my God! Let me out of here, Louis!
You crazy? Dropping bombs out there. Yeah, let's do it for our country. The red, white, and the blue. It's Uncle Sam who's asking, so your mother will approve. Tomorrow I'll be fighting, and I'll win this war for you. Let's do it for our country. Our country wants us to.
Okay, so I do need to see when Grease 2 came out. Because you still, have bomb shelters, 1982. Okay, so, the bomb shelters and still that, terror and fear still happening in the movies. Okay. All right. So next we have The American Dream, Suburbs. In 1940, 44% of people were homeowners, and then in the suburbs, and then in 1960, 62% were homeowners. Now, this was white people. This was not people of color or African Americans. Because we told you that even with the GI Bill, banks would not give them, they wouldn't give them loans, and they weren't allowed to live in white neighborhoods. They had to live in black communities, and banks would not give them loans. So they had to rent. Levittown, it was in your book. William Levitt fabricated houses, thousands of them, and he bought some farmland in Long Island, and he made several subdivisions, and then people bought automobiles, cars, middle class. In 1950, the white population that was middle class was very large, and it's in your book. They made $20,000, but there really wasn't any access for the middle class for black families. They only made $11,000. Okay, and then we come to the baby boom, which was 1946 to 1964. I've heard a little bit later. And the baby boom was the largest generation in U.S. history. Marriage rates were up after the war. The average age for a man to get married was 23, and the average age for a woman was 20. 17 magazine came out. There were things geared for teenagers, music, movies, rock and roll. Rock and roll came from Cleveland. Have you ever been to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland? It's awesome. But the reason it's in Cleveland is because Alan Freed was a DJ, and he came up and had the first rock and roll concert. So you had Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show. And you had movies, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, Mickey Mouse Club. And you even had movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which was supposed to kind of draw on communism and nuclear war. So I wanted to take a look at Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show. Now, this clip is pretty awesome because what normally happened on the Ed Sullivan Show was it was from the waist. It would be from the waist up so that you couldn't see them, gyrating their hips and dancing. So this video actually shows you when Elvis was first on the Ed Sullivan Show. It shows you him dancing and the girls going crazy. So I just think it's really funny because I've only seen the one where it's like the waist up. So here's Elvis. And Ed Sullivan had just actually had a car wreck, and he wasn't even there. He did not want to have Elvis on the show, but his ratings were plummeting. And he was going to pay him $5,000 for the show. And then he didn't want Elvis. So the people that were running the show were going to pay him $5,000. And then by the time he finally got Elvis to kind of help his ratings go up, which 82% of the whole country was watching. Isn't that crazy? Ed Sullivan had a car wreck, so there was a guest introducing him. And they had to film it in LA because Elvis was doing his first movie and he couldn't go to New York at that time. So then they paid Elvis $50,000 to come on the Ed Sullivan Show 3 times. So let's take a look. Elvis Presley. Should be it. Elvis. And I'll put myself in the corner. And here we go.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog, you're crying all the time.
So they would have had the
Well, you
waist
ain't
down.
never hunted around and you ain't no friend of mine.
Blonde show.
Well, they said you were high class. Well, that was just fine. Yeah, they said you were high class. Well, that was just fine.
Make you dance. I have no idea.
You ain't nothing but a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine. You ain't nothing but a hound dog.
That is censored.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog. Well, you ain't nothing but a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine.
All right, you have to watch that. And did you know I was actually a sub once upon a time teaching a music class, and I found out that Elvis was actually a twin. His twin died, but he was a twin. Okay, so then we want to come to the Double V campaign, which stood for Double Victory. You know, all these African American soldiers had risked their lives in World War II to get rid of discrimination and treating the Jews poorly, and then they come home and they want equality, but they still weren't equal, because we talked about, you know, the GI banks still said no and that sort of thing. April 15th, 1947, you have Jackie Robinson joining baseball. I don't know if you've seen the movie 42, but it's fantastic. In 1954, you have Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, and Thurgood Marshall was the attorney, and he won. And it was, the nation was ordered to desegregate. What's really cool about Thurgood Marshall was he was the first Black U.S. Supreme Court Justice. And it was because he won this case and he made a reputation and name for himself. I went to Arlington Cemetery 2 years ago. I visited D.C. with my boys. And that was one of the coolest moments of my life. I saw where JFK was buried and that sort of thing. But over across the way is Thurgood Marshall. And I have a picture of his tombstone, and just what a hero in American history. You have the Little Rock Nine. The governor, Orville Faubus, called the National Guard to stop desegregation. The U.S. Army and 101st Airborne Unit was sent by the president. And they escorted the first 9 African-American children to attend a white school in Kansas, Topeka, Kansas, Little Rock, actually. So the governor closed all the schools where there would be blacks and whites attending school together. And then the Supreme Court had to force them to reopen. And your book really talks about, you know, the Southern Manifesto. Many of the whites actually took their children out of school, so they didn't have to go to school with blacks. And they would put them in private white schools in basements where officials couldn't mandate or, you know, really find them. So this was really a battle of states' rights versus federal rights. And, you know, when it's something so egregious as segregation, that it is not, it's not acceptable. Talks about the KKK. They sent letters to the school board. They said that they were all communist, and it said that they had threatened to kill them. Then we come to Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy. He was from Chicago. He went to Mississippi to visit some cousins, and they went into a store, and he was with his cousins, and he whistled at the store owner's wife, and he was mutilated for it. Some white men went and pulled him out of the home he was staying in. He was 14 years old. His cousins are asked in this short video I'm going to show you. His cousins are asked, you know, why? Why did he whistle? Nothing wrong. I mean, I have a 13-year-old who is goofy as can be. I have 3 sons. And they said, you know, he just loved to make us laugh, do silly things, but he didn't know it would get him killed. And he was his mother's only son. Really, really very sad. So we're going to take a look at that. His mother, it was her only son, and she wanted to show the world how cruel Southern racism could be. And so she had it as an open casket. And that casket is now in the museum and I'll talk about that in the short clip, but it's in the museum in Washington, D.C. And this was the Museum of the History of African American Heritage, and it was so full we couldn't even get in. So we did get to go to the Holocaust Museum, but I have to go back and see this museum because it's absolutely supposed to be phenomenal historically. All right, so let's watch this very short video on Emmett Till. Okay. So this is the museum, and they're telling his story.
Of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. is open to visitors after its dedication ceremony last weekend. It connects the artifacts and the images of the past to the realities of the present. And one of the museum's most anticipated exhibits is a casket that carried the body of a 14-year-old boy 61 years ago. It is so sacred that visitors are not allowed to take videos or pictures. You have to go see it in person. Michelle Miller shows us a story behind the casket's place in history. Michelle, good morning.
Good morning. Well, it was 1955. The U.S. Supreme Court had outlawed legal segregation the year before, yet blacks were still living under a reign of terror. That same year, a teenage boy became the latest victim of it. His story may have been lost to history if not for his mother's decision to expose his brutal death. We warn you, these images can be hard to watch. Before the protests in Charlotte and Ferguson, or the chants of Black Lives Matter, what do we want? Justice! What do we want? Now! There was the story of Emmett Till. It started when the 14-year-old walked into a Mississippi general store with his cousins.
Emmett said nothing out of line. Mrs. Bryant came out behind us. For some reason, Emmett whistled at her. Wolf whistle.
Why did he do that?
I tell people, I said, I think he wanted us to laugh.
Police found Emmett's body floating in a river 7 days later, so badly beaten, his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, could barely identify him.
I saw his tongue had been choked out, and it was lying down on his chin.
A young filmmaker named Keith Beauchamp interviewed her 16 years ago, shortly before her death.
This eye was out, and it was lying about midway the cheek. And I discovered a hole. I said, now, was it necessary to shoot him? I said, I want the world to see this, because there's no way I could tell this story and give them the visual picture of what my son looked like.
In the midst of grief, disbelief, and horror, Mobley made the decision to expose her only child to the world. These photos of his body in an open casket were published in the black press.
It's unbelievable that someone can do that to another human being. It's just put in your mind how evil those people were.
those black people in the Deep South, this was finally testimony to what they endured.
Michael Eric Dyson is a Georgetown University sociology professor.
It was meant to make them stay in their places. Instead, it ignited a movement.
Rosa Parks said it was Till's face she saw when refusing to give up her seat on an Alabama bus. Martin Luther King Jr. summoned his memory during the Montgomery Bus Boycott.
This one image conjured the pain, the acrimony of lynching, and showed to America, this is what you do to us. This is evil.
The essence of justice is truth, and you cannot have justice without truth.
Filmmaker Keith Beauchamp has spent the last 25 years on a quest for both, unearthing new details about Till's death that he's revealing in an upcoming feature film. His chance to finally tell the complete story. When you see that photo and you juxtapose it against the video of Rodney King, Alton Sterling, and Philando Castile, Tamir Rice, does it still have the same impact?
There's no other story in civil rights history that will speak to this generation than the story of Emmett Till.
No one was ever convicted of Till's murder, but his mother believes his legacy has become his justice.
It took something to stir people up and let them know that we're either going to stand together or we're going to fall together.
And that filmmaker's reporting led the FBI to reopen this case. In 2005, Till's body was exhumed, but his casket left forgotten until a family member found it and then donated it to the museum.
Yeah, and they don't allow photographs there out of respect for the family, but you go and you can sit and see the casket. It's smaller than you might think. People are literally there weeping. There's his pictures in the casket that you can barely see, and people sit there and weep just being in the same room with
Line 45 minutes long.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
Okay. Whoops. Okay. Okay, now we're back. Okay, so they did mention Rosa Parks, and she was also in your book. Something you need to really know about Rosa Parks is she was the NAACP secretary, and she had a college degree, and she failed the Georgia literary test given only to blacks in the South to keep them from voting. She failed it 3 times, and there is no way in the world that she failed it because she had a college degree and she was the secretary for the NAACP, so we know she could read and write. But it was a matter of they knew who she was going to vote for, so they were going to throw away her ballot or make it invalid. Okay, so the Montgomery Bus Boycott was December 1st, 1955. So I want to talk about Coney Island, which is something a little closer to home. You may not have known this, but there is, I'm trying to think where it is. There is, might be in, it's in Martin Luther King Jr.'s writings somewhere where he talks about watching, the television, and he sees, he's with one of his daughters, and I've actually got to hear one of his daughters speak, which is amazing. She was very little at the time of his death, very sad. But one of his daughters that was older is watching the TV with her dad, and there is a commercial for an amusement park. And she says, and he writes about this, and she says, Daddy, can we go there? Can you take us there? And he is crushed because the only people who are allowed to go are whites. So, think about someplace in Cincinnati, Kings Island or Disney World or Disneyland, if it was back in that time period, only whites could go. Blacks could not. Well, in Cincinnati, Coney Island was an amusement park, and it's very close to my house, and I usually get a pass, and I love to go there in the summers. But in 1952, Coney Island did not allow blacks to enter the swimming pool because it was segregated. And we have one of our own heroes who her name is Marian Spencer, and she was the first Black woman that was on Cincinnati City Council. And one of her first fights for racial justice was fighting to get Coney opened to all people. So I wanted to oops, right there. Okay, so I just wanted to show you a picture of her. So here's a picture of her when she's very young. All right, and Marian Spencer Way. So there is a street named after her. And there she is. All right, picture of her. Marian Spencer Hall on the UC campus. Marian Spencer Way. So I just wanted to, she has since passed away, but I just wanted to show you, one of our own civil rights heroes. And I've actually had some kids in class, in college classes, that their grandparents actually picketed outside of Coney Island to get all people, to get it open to all people and not have it segregated. Okay, so that is chapter 12, and we covered a lot of things, and we saw some really cool videos. I hope you enjoyed them, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thanks. History rocks.